They always said our family was special. The Hartwoods, people would whisper at the grocery store, like the name itself was gilded with gold. On Sundays, when we rolled up to church in polished Cadillacs, people turned their heads as if royalty had arrived. Smiles, compliments, deference. From the outside, we were everything an American dynasty should be. But here's the truth. It was all performance. And the director of the show was my grandmother, Margaret Hartwood. To the town, she was the saintly matriarch, the woman who had buried 2 husbands but never her faith and family. The woman who raised 7 children on grit and discipline, who still found the strength to open her home to foster kids when the county couldn't find placements. Her house was never empty. Her table was never short of food. Her heart, people said, had no bottom. And I believed it once. As a child, I thought she was invincible. Her presence filled every room, her voice, steady, commanding, yet warm. Her perfume, lavender and soap, her rules carved in stone. But if you looked close, you saw the cracks, and I saw them earlier than most. The portraits told on us. Along the grand hallway of the Hartwood estate, rows of oil paintings showed smiling faces, posed in their finest. But stare long enough, and the smiles start to look forced. One cousin's eyes were glassy from tears wiped too quickly. An uncle's jaw clenched in permanent irritation. A shadow on my grandmother's face. Not joy, but control. Those portraits weren't records of happiness. They were propaganda. I learned that lesson the day my uncle humiliated me in front of everyone. I was 12. We were gathered for one of those over-the-top Sunday dinners. Crystal glasses, silverware polished to a mirror shine, roast beef steaming in the center of the table. I made the mistake of talking about wanting to be an artist. The table went silent. My uncle leaned back, looked at me with that smug smirk he always wore, and said loudly, "You'll always be the family failure, Leah. Don't embarrass us with dreams." Laughter followed, nervous, sharp, like knives clinking on china. My grandmother didn't correct him. She just cleared her throat and changed the subject. And in that silence, I realized something. The Hartwoods weren't a family. We were a performance troupe, and I was the bad actor. From then on, I noticed things I hadn't before. At Christmas, when neighbors dropped by, my mother and aunts would lock arms, smiling as if nothing in the world could break them. But as soon as the door closed, their voices would turn sharp, slicing at each other over debts and inheritances. At weddings, my cousins would toast to family forever, while glaring daggers at whoever got a larger gift from my grandmother that year. Even funerals felt staged. Perfect black outfits, crocodile tears, and whispered gossip about who would inherit what. The truth was always there, if you looked past the polish. Resentment, envy, hunger. But none of it could have existed without her, my grandmother. She kept us moving like gears in a machine. She knew when to smile at a neighbor, when to scold a child, when to arrange the photo that would end up in the town paper. She wasn't just holding us together. She was holding the illusion together. And in her way, I think she believed it was love. Her motto was simple. Hartwoods don't fall apart. But that iron command was less about protecting us, and more about protecting the dynasty she had built with her own hands. And in that dynasty, there was no room for failure, especially not me. Looking back, I think the Hartwood mansion was the perfect metaphor for our lives. From the driveway, it was breathtaking. Sprawling lawns, a fountain with cherubs, windows that glowed at night like beacons. But step inside, and you'd find a house of rules and whispers. Doors closed more often than they opened. Secrets tucked in every drawer. It was a gilded cage. Beautiful, impressive, but a cage all the same. And while the world admired it, I was trapped inside, learning the truth. When a family cares more about appearances than love, the cracks don't just stay hidden. They grow, and one day they shatter everything. The morning of the funeral felt wrong before it even began. The sky was a dull, heavy gray, the kind of weather you'd expect for mourning. But the Hartwoods weren't there to mourn. We were there to perform one last act, and everyone knew their lines. Except me. The chapel was small, almost too small for the reputation of a woman like Margaret Hartwood. She could have filled a cathedral. Instead, we sat in a cramped room with fake candles flickering against peeling wallpaper. The air smelled of lilies, but it wasn't comforting. It was suffocating. Inside, the family sat in rows, stiff and rehearsed. My aunts in pearls, my uncles in tailored black suits, my cousins fidgeting in clothes too expensive for their age, faces painted with grief, but eyes scanning the room, already calculating, who's here, who isn't, who will get what. And at the front, standing at the pulpit, was a pastor no one recognized. He wasn't her friend. He wasn't her confidant. He wasn't even her choice. He was just a name pulled from somewhere, reading a script he barely skimmed. Margaret was a woman of great conviction, he began, fumbling with his notes. His voice echoed off the stained glass, flat and empty. And then, unbelievably, he tried to lighten the moment with a clumsy joke. The kind of hollow line that drew a few awkward chuckles but rang false in the air. I froze. Did no one else hear how wrong this was? My grandmother wasn't someone to be reduced to clichés or punchlines. She was personal. She believed in discipline, in usefulness, in love wrapped in steel. And now, her life was being flattened into empty words by a man who had never shared a meal with her, never heard her laugh, never watched her wipe her hands on her apron after cooking for 20 people. I looked at my family. My mother dabbed her eyes with a tissue. No tears, just the motion of them. My uncle checked his watch. My cousins whispered behind their hands. The truth hit me like a slap. This wasn't her funeral. This was the funeral of the illusion she had built. After the service, we moved to the reception hall. Food was laid out in silver trays, untouched. People hovered in groups, trading stories that sounded more like resumes than memories. She was such a pillar of the community. She never missed a church donation drive. She raised the family so well. Lies. They weren't celebrating her. They were celebrating the image she'd forced us to uphold. That's when it happened. My uncle, the same one who had branded me the family failure years ago, pulled me aside. He leaned in close, his breath sour with whiskey, and whispered words I will never forget. You will always be the failure. Don't embarrass us with a speech. It wasn't just cruelty. It was strategy. He wanted to keep me small, silent, erased. He wanted to protect the illusion, even now, even here, at the end. And I wanted to scream. I wanted to stand up in that hall and tell them all the truth. That our family wasn't whole, wasn't united, wasn't what the world thought it was. But I didn't. I bit my tongue. Because grief is like a magnifying glass. It takes small cracks and turns them into canyons. And that day, the canyon between me and my family was wider than ever. The rest of the afternoon passed like a blur. Strangers offered condolences, shaking my hand as if I'd lost a queen. My cousins posed for photos outside the chapel, posting them to social media with captions like "Family First." I watched them line up, smile, and thought, this is a play with no audience, just actors pretending to believe their own script. I stood in the corner, silent. And in that silence, I realized something chilling. We weren't mourning her. We were mourning the end of her control. For decades, grandmother had been the glue, the iron fist in the velvet glove. Without her, the mask was slipping. And what lay beneath wasn't unity. It was greed, resentment, secrets. The performance was over. The curtain had fallen, and the family was about to face its final act. The day after the funeral, we gathered at the old law office downtown. The building was everything you'd expect from a family reckoning. Wood-paneled walls, shelves of dusty books no one had opened in years, and the smell of old paper clinging to the air. A storm brewed outside, rain streaking down the tall windows, thunder rolling faintly in the distance. It felt staged, like the universe knew this was the moment masks would come off. We sat in a long, polished conference room. My aunts, lined up like statues. My cousins, whispering nervously. My uncle, the self-proclaimed patriarch in waiting, puffed up in his chair, certain that the fortune was about to land squarely in his lap. My parents sat beside him, eyes cast down, silent. And me, shoved at the far end of the table, as if my presence was an afterthought. The failure. The lawyer cleared his throat. He was an old man with shaky hands, holding a crisp white envelope. The silence was suffocating. Every breath, every shuffle of papers sounded like a cannon in that room. "This," he said, "is Margaret Hartwood's final letter." I expected a will, a clean division of assets, some money here, property there, maybe even a token acknowledgement of my existence. What we got was a bomb. The lawyer began to read. "My beloved family, if you are hearing these words, it means I am gone, and perhaps for the first time, you will listen to me without interruption." Already the air shifted. My aunts straightened in their seats. My uncle's smirk faltered. "I have lived my life as your matriarch, holding you together with rules, with discipline, with love that sometimes must have felt like iron. But I know what you whispered behind my back. I know about the debts you hid, the lies you told, the cruelty you allowed." Gasps. Someone dropped a pen. I felt my pulse in my throat. "I cannot take secrets with me to the grave, so I will not. This is not a will. This is the truth." Line by line, she stripped the family bare. She named my uncle directly, accusing him of stealing from her accounts and covering it with falsified receipts. My aunt was called out for manipulating other relatives into loans she never repaid. Cousins were exposed for forging signatures, for gambling away inheritances before they even had them. And then, my name. "Leah, you have been treated as the outcast. They called you the failure. I let them, thinking it would make you stronger. That was my mistake. You were never the failure. You were the only one who didn't wear a mask." The room froze. My uncle shot daggers at me with his eyes, jaw tight, fists clenched on the table. The lawyer continued. "As for my estate, I leave no one the illusion of wealth. The assets will be sold. The proceeds will go to charities I chose myself. You will inherit nothing, except the truth. Do with it what you will." Chaos erupted. My aunt gasped, "This can't be legal." My uncle slammed his fist against the table. "She's senile. This is manipulation." Cousins shouted over each other, already plotting challenges, lawsuits, betrayals within betrayals. But I sat there, silent, as if the storm outside had moved into my chest. I thought back to a different letter. Years before, after I had finally achieved a small success, a business deal that pulled me out of the shadows. I'd received a note from the family. I'd opened it with trembling hands, expecting pride. Instead, it was a list of demands. "We are counting on you. Don't let us down." No congratulations, no acknowledgement, just entitlement. A reminder that I existed only to serve the dynasty. Now, hearing my grandmother's final words, it felt like that cycle had been broken. But not gently. Violently. Interpretations flew across the room. Some said she had tried to reconcile us, forcing truth into the open so we could heal. Others whispered it was vengeance, her final act of rebellion, burning down the empire she had built with her own hands. I thought of history. In ancient China, there was a punishment called the 9 familial exterminations. If one person committed a crime, Their entire bloodline, parents, children, cousins, servants, could be executed. One person's action destroying everyone connected. That's what her letter was. An execution. A total annihilation. And in that moment, I realized something chilling. My grandmother, who spent her whole life building a dynasty, had chosen to end it. The lawyer folded the paper. Silence returned, heavy, final. But the truth was alive now, spreading like fire through every corner of that room, and nothing would ever put it out. After the letter, nothing was the same. The Hartwoods had been a fortress, a monument to legacy. But one piece of paper turned it into rubble. Within a week, the lawsuits began. Cousins sued cousins. Siblings turned on each other like wolves. The illusion of family forever was dead, and all that was left was greed and rage. The mansion was the first casualty. That house on the hill, once the stage for every photo, every Sunday dinner, every illusion, it had to be sold. The proceeds went straight to charities my grandmother had named, just like she said. Watching strangers carry out our furniture, loading trucks with the portraits that once hung as propaganda. It felt like watching the dynasty itself get dismantled brick by brick. Neighbors whispered. Newspapers picked it up. The Hartwoods, once admired, had become a scandal. At the grocery store, people didn't nod with respect anymore. They smirked, whispered, turned away. Our name, once heavy with prestige, now tasted like ash. But the worst wasn't public humiliation. It was what happened inside the family. My uncle, the loudest voice in the room, refused to let go. He swore he'd reclaim the dynasty by any means necessary. And in his desperation, he crossed a line. One morning I got a call from the bank. My signature had been used to authorize a withdrawal of $45,000. My stomach dropped. I hadn't signed anything. My uncle had forged my name. When I confronted him, shaking with fury, he didn't even deny it. He just leaned back in his chair and said, "The family needed it more than you. Consider it your contribution." I turned to my parents, expecting outrage, defense, protection. Instead, they lowered their eyes and muttered, "It's better this way. Don't fight him." That was it. The final break. I wasn't part of this family. I was just collateral. But what they didn't understand was this. They had freed me. I walked away. And for the first time in my life, I wasn't carrying the weight of the Hartwood name on my shoulders. I was just Leah. And Leah was angry, but also patient. Revenge doesn't come in a scream. It comes in silence. While they tore each other apart in court, I built quietly. I used the resources I had, the connections I'd made, the lessons I'd learned from watching them scheme. And when the time was right, I struck. My uncle's pride was his business. A sprawling network of family enterprises, half of them smoke and mirrors. For years, he bragged at dinners about contracts, about deals, about money that never stops flowing. But I knew the truth. I knew about the forged receipts, the shell companies, the fraudulent loans. I gathered everything. Documents, testimonies, records he thought were buried. And then I exposed him. Not in anger, not with a shout, but with precision. A quiet leak to regulators. A packet mailed to journalists. Within months, his empire collapsed. His accounts frozen. His reputation shredded in the same town where he once demanded respect. He became a ghost, hiding from creditors, from reporters, from neighbors who now crossed the street to avoid him. The patriarch in waiting had been dethroned by the very person he once called the failure. The rest of the family scattered. Some fled the state, chasing new beginnings. Others stayed, bitter and broken, clinging to fragments of a name that no longer meant anything. The house was gone. The wealth was gone. The unity was gone. And And me? I stood in the ashes, breathing freely for the first time. Because here's the truth no one tells you. Sometimes, losing everything is the only way to find yourself. For years, I thought I was trapped in the Hartwood Dynasty, doomed to play the role they'd written for me. But my grandmother's letter, her reckoning, burned the script. And in the ruins, I could finally write my own story. People still ask me sometimes if I regret it, if I regret not fighting harder to save the family. My answer? You can't save what was never real. The Hartwoods were a dynasty of masks, and once the masks were gone, there was nothing underneath. So no, I don't regret it. The dynasty is dead. But me, for the first time in my life, I'm alive.